My twin brother appeared at my door, covered in bruises. His wife's brothers had been beating him for a year. So we switched places, and I made sure they'd never forget it. All right, Reddit. My identical twin brother showed up at my apartment last year looking like he'd been through a war zone. Turns out his wife's brothers had been using him as a punching bag for over 12 months. He asked me to switch places with him so he could escape and heal. I agreed, and spent 7 weeks living his nightmare while documenting everything. Then I invited those guys to dinner and watched their world burn. Here's how it went down. I'm Nathan, 32 male, work as a civil engineer for a construction firm in Seattle. Decent career, own my condo, drive a reliable truck, live a pretty straightforward life. My twin brother Ethan and I are identical. Same height, same build, same facial features down to the small scar above our left eyebrow from a childhood bike accident. Growing up, we used to mess with people constantly, switching classes in high school, pretending to be each other at family gatherings. Our parents could tell us apart, but most other people struggled unless they knew us really well. We stayed close through college and into adulthood, even though our paths diverged professionally. Ethan went into marketing, met his wife Kristen at a company event about 5 years ago, got married after a whirlwind romance, had a daughter named Sophie who just turned 4. I was his best man at the wedding, watched him beam with happiness as he said his vows. He seemed genuinely content with his life. Good job, beautiful family, nice house in the suburbs. That's why I was completely unprepared for what happened that Tuesday evening in March. I was sitting at my kitchen table, halfway through reviewing blueprints for a commercial project, when I heard the knock. It wasn't the confident rap of a friend dropping by or the quick tap of a delivery driver. This knock was hesitant, almost apologetic, like whoever stood on the other side wasn't sure they deserved to be there. I remember setting down my coffee mug and walking to the door with this vague sense of unease already settling in my chest. When I opened that door, I didn't immediately recognize the person standing there. Not because he looked different from me. We're identical twins, mirrors of each other in almost every physical way, but because the person in front of me seemed diminished somehow, like someone had taken my confident, successful brother and hollowed him out from the inside. His shoulders were hunched forward, his head bowed. When he finally looked up at me, I saw the bruises. These weren't the kind you get from tripping over furniture or bumping into a cabinet door. They were deliberate, methodical. A dark purple bloom spread across his left cheekbone, edges fading into sickly yellow-green. His bottom lip was split, crusted with dried blood that hadn't been properly cleaned. When he shifted his weight, I noticed how he winced, how he held his ribs like they might crack open if he moved too quickly. His knuckles were raw, scraped clean of skin in places. There was a haunted look in his eyes that I'd never seen before, not even when we were kids, and things were genuinely hard after Mom died. This was different. This was the look of someone who'd been systematically broken down over an extended period. I stepped back without thinking, pulling the door wider. Ethan walked past me into the apartment like a ghost drifting through a life he no longer belonged to. I closed the door behind him, locked it, and turned to face him. He stood in the middle of my living room, arms wrapped around himself, staring at the floor. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, until I finally managed to say his name. He flinched at the sound of it. That small reaction, so unlike the confident, charismatic brother I'd known all my life, sent a cold spike of fear straight through me. What happened? My voice came out rougher than I intended, sharp with worry and the beginnings of anger. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sank down onto the edge of my couch, moving carefully like every part of him hurt. He rested his elbows on his knees and let his head hang forward, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, broken and raw in a way that made my chest ache. "It's Kristen's brothers," he said simply. "Blake and Craig." My stomach dropped. I knew them vaguely. Loud, overbearing guys who dominated every family gathering, who spoke over everyone and acted like they owned whatever space they occupied. Blake was the older one, probably 35, worked in construction management. Craig was younger, around 30, did something in sales. Both of them had that aggressive confidence that comes from never being seriously challenged. I'd always thought they were just the kind of people you tolerate because you have to, not because you want to. But this was something else entirely. Over the next 2 hours, Ethan told me everything. The story came out in fragments, his voice cracking, his hands shaking as he described what had been happening for the past year. It started small, he explained. A shove here, a harsh word there, always framed as rough play between guys, always dismissed as brotherly teasing. They mocked him at family dinners, belittled his career in marketing, called him soft weak, not man enough for their sister. Kristen would laugh along sometimes, or worse, say nothing at all. Just look away while they tore him down piece by piece. Ethan thought he could endure it. He figured if he kept his head down, stayed quiet, proved himself somehow, they'd eventually leave him alone. But it got worse. They started coming to the house unannounced, barging in like they owned the place, taking food from the fridge, changing channels on the TV, making it clear that Ethan had no say in his own home. They'd watch him when Kristen wasn't around, testing boundaries, pushing harder each time. One night about 6 months ago, Blake shoved Ethan into a wall when he politely asked them to leave because Sophie was trying to sleep upstairs. Ethan tried to stand his ground, tried to establish some basic boundaries. That's when the first real beating happened. They cornered him in the garage one Saturday afternoon, told him he was embarrassing the family, that he needed to learn his place. Craig held him while Blake hit him, methodical and cold, like he was teaching a lesson rather than losing his temper. They warned him not to tell anyone, especially not Kristen. They said no one would believe him anyway, and if he tried to make it a problem, they'd make sure he lost everything. His marriage, his daughter, his reputation. They'd paint him as unstable, violent, a liar. And because they were Kristen's brothers, because the family always closed ranks around their own, Ethan knew they could do it. He'd seen how Kristen's parents, Frank and Patricia, doted on Blake and Craig, how they could do no wrong in their eyes. So he stayed silent. He took the bruises and the threats and the humiliation, and he tried to survive. The beatings became more frequent. Blake would show up while Kristen was at work, push his way inside, and use Ethan as a punching bag for whatever frustration he was feeling that day. Craig would join sometimes, holding Ethan down while Blake worked him over. They were careful, mostly body shots that could be hidden under clothing, occasional facial bruises that Ethan explained away as accidents at work or clumsiness around the house. Kristen noticed the bruises but accepted his explanations without question. Maybe she didn't want to see the truth. Maybe she was willfully blind to what her brothers were doing. Either way, she never pushed, never demanded real answers, never chose to protect her husband over maintaining peace with her family. The worst part, Ethan told me, was how they used Sophie as leverage. They'd make subtle threats about what could happen to a little girl if her father wasn't careful. They'd talk about custody battles, about how judges always favor the mother, about how easy it would be to make Ethan look like an unfit parent. Those threats kept him paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "I'm afraid all the time," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Afraid they'll escalate. Afraid they'll hurt Sophie. Afraid Kristen will choose them over me if I force her to pick a side. I feel like I'm drowning, and I don't see a way out." That's when he looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed and desperate, and asked if I would help him, not in some vague, eventual way. He needed help immediately. He said he needed to disappear for a while, to get away and breathe and figure out what to do next. But he couldn't just leave. Blake and Craig would go after him, or worse, they'd take their frustration out on Sophie. He needed someone to take his place. Just for a little while, just long enough to buy him time. And because we were twins, because we'd spent our whole lives being mistaken for each other, because no one outside our immediate family could really tell us apart, unless they looked closely, he thought maybe I could do it. He was asking me to become him, to step into his life, wear his face, endure what he'd been enduring while he slipped away somewhere safe and tried to heal. I should have said no. Any reasonable person would have. The plan was insane, dangerous, and legally questionable at best. But I didn't say no. I looked at my brother, my twin, my other half, the person I'd shared a womb with, who knew me better than anyone else in the world, and I saw how broken he was. I saw the bruises and the fear and the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. I couldn't let him go back to that house alone. I couldn't let those men keep hurting him, grinding him down until there was nothing left. So I said yes. I told him I would do it. I would trade places with him, move into his life, face his tormentors, and buy him the time he needed to escape. But more than that, I decided I would make sure Blake and Craig paid for what they'd done. I wouldn't just survive in his place. I would set a trap. I would gather evidence, expose their cruelty, and dismantle the power they held over him. I would teach them a lesson they'd never forget. We spent the next 3 days planning every detail with military precision. I moved into Ethan's apartment temporarily while we prepared, using my condo as a staging area for the equipment and documentation we'd need. Ethan walked me through every aspect of the routines that made up his daily existence, from how he tied his shoes to the specific route he took to work, avoiding certain streets because they added stress to his morning. He showed me his office workspace through photos and videos he'd taken discreetly on his phone. I memorized the names of his coworkers, David, who sat in the next cubicle and always wanted to talk about sports, Linda from accounting, who brought in homemade cookies every Friday, his boss Jennifer, who had unrealistic expectations about turnaround times. I learned about his ongoing marketing campaigns, familiarized myself with the clients he was handling, studied the industry jargon he used daily. The evenings were dedicated to understanding his home life. Ethan played videos of Sophie at dinner during playtime, getting ready for bed. I studied how he interacted with her, the specific voices he used when reading different characters in her storybooks, the way he'd count down from 5 when she was stalling bedtime, how he'd celebrate when she drew a new picture. Sophie was obsessed with dinosaurs lately, particularly velociraptors, and she loved drawing elaborate scenes of them in jungles. She had a stuffed triceratops named Mr. Stompy that went everywhere with her. Kristen was more complicated. Ethan explained how she liked her coffee, 2 sugars, splash of cream, served in the blue mug she'd gotten from her parents. She worked as a billing coordinator at a medical office downtown, usually left the house by 7:30, got home around 5:15. She hated discussing work at home, preferred watching reality TV shows in the evenings, and had gotten into the habit of scrolling through social media on her phone rather than engaging in actual conversation. She wasn't always like this, Ethan said quietly one night. When we first got married, we'd talk for hours. We'd make plans, dream about the future, but somewhere along the way, she started pulling back. I think it was when her brothers started coming around more often. She chose them over me, piece by piece, until there wasn't much of us left. The marriage had been eroding for at least 2 years, he explained. Small moments of disconnection that added up over time. Kristen prioritizing her brother's opinions over Ethan's feelings, dismissing his concerns about their intrusive behavior, making jokes at his expense when they mocked him, treating it like harmless sibling teasing instead of the systematic undermining it actually was. Most importantly, Ethan walked me through the dynamics with Blake and Craig in painful detail. Blake typically showed up on Wednesday evenings, sometimes Thursday afternoons if he'd taken the day off work. He'd let himself in without knocking, using the key Kristen had given him during the first year of their marriage. Blake would immediately establish dominance, helping himself to food, commenting on the state of the house, asking intrusive questions about their finances or marriage. The physical intimidation would start subtle, standing too close, backing Ethan into corners during conversation, touching him in aggressive ways disguised as friendly pats on the shoulder that were actually just hard enough to hurt. If Kristen wasn't home, Blake would escalate, shoving Ethan against walls, grabbing his shirt collar, getting right in his face while making threats about what would happen if he ever complained to Kristen about their visits. Craig was different, more calculated in his approach. He'd show up on weekends, usually Saturday mornings, when Kristen took Sophie to her parents' house for a few hours. Craig would bring takeout, act friendly initially, then gradually shift into interrogation mode. He'd ask about Ethan's job performance, his salary, his retirement planning, his adequacy as a husband and father. Every question was designed to undermine and diminish. Craig's the one who first threatened Sophie, Ethan told me, his voice shaking with the memory. He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. Just mentioned how easy it would be for a kid to have an accident, how tragic it would be if something happened to her, because her father couldn't protect her properly. He smiled while he said it, Nathan. Smiled like he was enjoying watching me realize how powerless I was. Both brothers had keys, both felt entitled to show up whenever they wanted, and both had made it crystal clear that if Ethan ever told Kristen the full extent of what was happening, they'd make sure he lost everything. They'd already discussed strategy, how they'd claim Ethan was mentally unstable, how they'd present his inevitable defensive injuries as evidence he was violent, how they'd paint themselves as concerned brothers trying to protect their sister from an abusive husband. It was a calculated campaign of terror, and they'd been getting away with it because Ethan was paralyzed by fear of losing Sophie, and because no one in Kristen's family would believe him over her brothers. I set up hidden cameras throughout the house, small devices designed to look like everyday objects. A clock on the mantle, a phone charger on the kitchen counter, a smoke detector in the hallway, all of them recording continuously to cloud storage that only I could access. I bought a small audio recorder that looked like a pen, kept it in my shirt pocket whenever I was home. I documented everything: the bruises Ethan already had, his account of previous incidents, copies of medical records from an ER visit where he'd claimed to have fallen downstairs. On the 4th day, we made the switch. Ethan cut his hair to match the slightly longer style I'd been wearing. We swapped clothes, wallets, phones, keys. I drove him to a remote cabin I'd rented 3 hours north of Seattle, helped him settle in with groceries and supplies for an extended stay. The place had no connection to either of us. Paid for with cash, off the grid enough that he could decompress without looking over his shoulder constantly. Stay here, I told him as we stood in the cabin's small living room. Rest, heal, process everything. I'll handle Blake and Craig. I'll document everything they do, and when I have enough evidence, we'll destroy them legally. Ethan looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Gratitude mixed with guilt, mixed with something like hope. I don't know how to thank you for this. You don't need to thank me. You're my brother. Now go take a long shower, sleep in a bed where you feel safe, and let yourself heal. I'll check in every few days. I drove back to Seattle that afternoon and moved into Ethan's house. Kristen was at work, Sophie at daycare. I walked through the rooms, familiarizing myself with the space, the layout, the small details that would help me sell the illusion. Family photos on the walls. Sophie's artwork stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. Kristen's reading glasses on the coffee table. When Kristen came home that evening with Sophie in tow, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Spaghetti with meat sauce, one of Ethan's standard weeknight meals. I'd practiced his body language in the mirror, the slightly hunched shoulders, the way he'd learned to make himself smaller, less threatening, less noticeable. Hey, I said when she walked in, keeping my voice level and neutral. Hey, she replied, barely looking at me as she set down her purse and helped Sophie out of her jacket. Traffic was awful. Sophie, go wash your hands for dinner. The 4-year-old bounded off toward the bathroom, and Kristen moved through the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone going through familiar motions. She didn't seem to notice anything different about me. Why would she? I was doing an excellent job of being Ethan, the beaten-down, careful version he'd become. That first evening passed without major incident. I read Sophie her bedtime story, a book about a velociraptor who wanted to be a ballerina, doing the voices for all the dinosaurs exactly the way Ethan had taught me. Sophie giggled at the T-Rex's silly dance moves and hugged Mister Stompy tight when I tucked her in. She looked up at me with complete trust, and the weight of what I was doing hit me hard. This little girl was depending on her father to protect her, and I had to maintain the illusion perfectly to keep her safe. Kristen watched TV in the living room while I cleaned the kitchen, methodically wiping down counters and loading the dishwasher exactly how Ethan said he did it every night. She barely acknowledged me, absorbed in some reality show about wealthy housewives fighting over catering drama. We went to bed without much conversation. I slept in the guest room, claiming I had a cold and didn't want to get her sick, an excuse Ethan had suggested, knowing Kristen had a thing about germs and would welcome the separation without question. The guest room became my operations center. After Kristen fell asleep, I'd review the day's recordings, make detailed notes, back up everything to multiple cloud storage locations. I created a spreadsheet tracking every incident, every threat, every moment that could be used as evidence. Dates, times, people present, exact words spoken, physical actions taken, all documented with the precision I normally applied to engineering projects. Blake showed up on Wednesday evening, right on schedule. I was home from work around 6, heating up leftovers in the microwave, when I heard his key in the lock. He walked in like he owned the place, didn't knock or announce himself, just strode into the kitchen and grabbed a soda from the refrigerator without asking. Hey there, champ, he said with that condescending tone Ethan had warned me about. Blake was a big guy, 6'2", probably 220, all of it from lifting weights at the gym rather than functional strength. He had that swagger of someone who'd never been seriously challenged, who'd spent his whole life getting away with bullying behavior because he was bigger and louder than everyone else. Rough day at the office pushing papers? I kept my eyes down, playing the role Ethan had inhabited for over a year. Just long, lots of meetings. Yeah, meetings. Blake laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all day. Must be real tough sitting in conference rooms talking about marketing strategies while real men do actual work. My crew poured foundation for a 3-story office building today. Built something real, you know? Something that'll actually last. The implication was clear. Ethan's career was meaningless. His work was worthless. He was less of a man because he didn't do physical labor. It was the same pattern Ethan had described, the same script Blake used to establish dominance and make his brother-in-law feel inferior. I didn't respond, just focused on my plate of reheated casserole. Blake circled the kitchen island, getting into my space, crowding me against the counter. This was how it always started, Ethan had explained. Small provocations designed to test boundaries and reinforce the power dynamic. Kristen working late again? Blake asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. She'll be home around 7. Good, good. Wouldn't want her to see her husband being such a pathetic loser, right? He shoved my shoulder, not hard enough to actually hurt, but aggressive enough to be intimidating. You're embarrassing her. You know that? My sister deserves better than some soft marketing geek who can't stand up for himself. She could have married anyone, but she settled for you. The recorder in my pocket was capturing every word with perfect clarity. The camera disguised as a kitchen clock was recording the video in high definition, showing Blake's aggressive posture, his invading my personal space, his hand on my shoulder. I let him continue his routine, absorbing the insults, responding with the submissive body language he expected. Hunched shoulders, downcast eyes, minimal verbal responses that wouldn't provoke further aggression. Blake spent about 20 minutes establishing his dominance. He criticized everything: the cleanliness of the kitchen, the food I was eating, my work clothes, my posture, my general existence. Every insult was designed to chip away at self-worth, to reinforce the idea that Ethan was worthless and should be grateful Blake and Craig tolerated him at all. When Kristen's car pulled into the driveway, Blake's demeanor shifted instantly. He became friendly, jovial, the concerned brother just checking in on his sister's family. He ruffled my hair in a gesture that might look affectionate to an outsider, but was actually another assertion of dominance, treating me like a child who needed his approval. "Good talk, champ," he said loudly enough for Kristen to hear as she walked through the door. "Just making sure my sister's being taken care of properly. Family's got to look out for each other, right?" Kristen smiled at him, oblivious to or deliberately ignoring what had just happened. "Thanks for checking in, Blake. You want to stay for dinner?" "Nah, got plans, but I'll see you this weekend at Mom and Dad's." He shot me a warning look as he left, a silent reminder to keep my mouth shut about everything that had just transpired. After he left, I sat at the dinner table with Kristen and Sophie, playing the role of the subdued, beaten-down husband and father, while internally cataloging everything for the eventual confrontation. Sophie chattered about her day at daycare, something about finger painting, and a friend who'd brought in cookies for everyone. I listened and responded appropriately, maintaining the illusion while the recorder in my pocket continued documenting every moment of my transformed life. That night, after Kristen and Sophie were asleep, I reviewed the footage and audio. It was perfect. Clear video showing Blake's aggression, pristine audio capturing every insult and threat. I added it to my growing evidence file, organizing everything chronologically, creating a narrative that would be impossible to deny or dismiss. I went through the same pattern for 7 weeks. Blake showed up twice a week, sometimes alone, sometimes with Craig. They'd let themselves in, mock me, push me around, occasionally escalate to actual violence. I documented everything, every insult, every shove, every punch. The cameras captured it all in high definition. Craig was different from Blake, less overtly aggressive but more calculating. He'd make threats about Sophie, talk about how easy it would be to prove I was an unfit father, describe in detail what could happen in a custody battle. Those recordings were particularly damning, showing premeditation and psychological abuse. The physical violence escalated around week 4. Blake showed up angry about something at his job, and he took it out on me in the garage. Craig held my arms while Blake worked me over, body shots mostly, a few hits to the face that I couldn't block. I let it happen, gritting my teeth, focusing on the recorder in my pocket and the camera I'd hidden in the garage ceiling. Kristen saw the new bruises that night. I was in the bathroom assessing the damage when she walked in. For a moment, I thought she might finally ask the right questions, might finally choose to see what was actually happening. But instead, she just sighed and said, "You need to be more careful." That response told me everything I needed to know about her complicity. She wasn't actively participating in the abuse, but she was enabling it through willful blindness. She'd chosen the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth. By week 6, I had dozens of hours of footage and audio recordings. Blake and Craig had assaulted me 7 times, made countless threats, and demonstrated a clear pattern of sustained abuse. I had enough evidence to bury them legally. Now I just needed to spring the trap. I planned it carefully. Kristen's parents were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, and the whole family was gathering for a dinner at their house. It was the perfect opportunity. Everyone in one place. No way for Blake and Craig to avoid the confrontation. Maximum exposure for their crimes. I told Ethan my plan during our nightly phone check-in. He was hesitant at first, worried about the potential for violence, but I convinced him this was the safest way. Public exposure, with witnesses, documentation ready to hand over to authorities. The night before the anniversary dinner, I prepared everything. Edited the most damning footage into a compilation video, organized the audio recordings chronologically, compiled hospital records and photographs of injuries. I burned copies to multiple USB drives, uploaded everything to secure cloud storage, and prepared packets for the police, Kristen's family, and Ethan's divorce attorney. Yes, I'd already retained one for him. Saturday evening, I arrived at Frank and Patricia's house with Kristen and Sophie. The place was full of extended family and family friends, probably 40 people total. Blake and Craig were already there, holding court in the living room, telling some story that had everyone laughing. When they saw me walk in, Blake smirked and made some comment about me actually showing up for once. Craig muttered something to his friend that made them both chuckle. They had no idea what was coming. Dinner was the usual family affair. Too much food, too many conversations happening at once, Frank telling stories about the early years of his marriage, while Patricia beamed beside him. I played my role perfectly, staying quiet, keeping my head down, being the diminished version of Ethan they all expected. After dessert, Frank stood up to give a speech thanking everyone for coming. When he finished, I stood up too. The room went quiet, confused. This wasn't part of the program. I'd like to say something as well, I announced, keeping my voice steady. About family and what it means to protect the people you love. Kristen shot me a warning look, clearly uncomfortable with me drawing attention. Blake and Craig exchanged glances, probably thinking I was about to embarrass myself somehow. I pulled out a small remote control and pointed it at the TV mounted on the dining room wall. I'd arranged with Frank earlier to set up a laptop connection, claiming I wanted to show family photos. He'd agreed without question. For the past 7 weeks, I continued as the screen flickered to life. I've been documenting something that's been happening in this family. Something that everyone here needs to see. The first video started playing. Blake entering Ethan's house uninvited, immediately beginning his verbal assault. The audio was crystal clear. Every insult and threat captured perfectly. The room went completely silent as people watched. Patricia gasped. Frank's face went red. Kristen turned pale. Blake started to stand, but his father barked at him to sit down and watch. The compilation continued. 7 weeks of abuse condensed into a devastating 12-minute presentation. Blake shoving me against walls. Craig holding me while Blake threw punches. Both of them making explicit threats about Sophie, about destroying Ethan's life if he ever spoke up. The footage was undeniable, time-stamped, showing faces clearly. Some of the women in the room started crying. Frank looked like he might have a heart attack. Blake and Craig sat frozen, their faces cycling through shock, anger, and finally fear as they realized the magnitude of what they were watching. When the video ended, the silence was deafening. I stood there in front of 40 witnesses and said, Blake and Craig have been systematically abusing Ethan for over a year. They've beaten him, threatened him, terrorized his daughter, and turned his home into a prison. And everyone in this family, everyone, let it happen. Blake exploded out of his chair, face twisted with rage. That's not, you can't. This is taken out of context. Context? I repeated calmly. Please explain the context where it's acceptable to beat your sister's husband and threaten a 4-year-old child. Craig tried a different approach, turning to his parents with desperation. Dad, this is insane. He's making this up somehow. We were just what? I interrupted. Just terrorizing someone for a year? Just breaking multiple laws, including assault, battery, terroristic threats, and criminal trespass? All of which I've documented and reported to the police. That's when I revealed the second part of my plan. 2 uniformed officers walked through the front door. I'd contacted them earlier, explained the situation, provided preliminary evidence. They'd agreed to stand by during the dinner, waiting for my signal. The officers approached Blake and Craig, informing them they were under arrest for assault, battery, criminal threats, and harassment. Blake started yelling about lawyers and false accusations. Craig went pale and silent. Both were handcuffed while their parents watched in horror, while friends and extended family stood frozen, while Kristen sobbed in the corner. As they were being let out, Blake turned to me with pure hatred in his eyes. You're going to regret this. We'll destroy you in court. We'll take everything. I looked at him calmly and said, You already tried to destroy someone for over a year. You tried to break him, to make him feel powerless and worthless. But I'm not your victim anymore. Blake's face went blank with confusion at that last statement, but before he could process it, the officers pulled him toward the door. Both brothers were loaded into patrol cars and driven away. The house was suddenly much quieter, just the soft sound of Patricia crying and people shifting uncomfortably. I turned to the remaining guests. I think it's time for everyone to leave. If anyone wants copies of the evidence for your own understanding of what's been happening, I can provide that. Otherwise, please go. Most people couldn't leave fast enough, offering awkward condolences or apologies, or just fleeing in shock. Patricia approached me before she left, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she said, voice breaking. I didn't know. I didn't know they were doing this. I looked at her and saw genuine horror in her eyes. Maybe you didn't know the extent of it, I replied, but there were signs. There were moments when you could have asked questions, could have wondered why your son-in-law looked increasingly afraid and beaten down. Those signs were there. Everyone chose not to see them. She nodded, crying harder, and left with Frank, who still hadn't said a word. Soon it was just me and Kristen in the living room. She sat on the couch, face blotchy from crying, and looked up at me with something like hatred. "How could you do this to my family?" she asked, voice shaking. "We're going to lose everything because of you." I sat down across from her, suddenly exhausted, as the adrenaline that had been keeping me going started to fade. "Kristen, your brothers have been beating your husband for over a year. They terrorized your daughter. They turned your home into a place of fear and violence, and you let them. You enabled them. You chose their approval over your family's safety. This didn't happen because of me. This happened because of choices you and your brothers made over and over again." She shook her head, still in denial. "But they were just being protective, making sure you were treating me right." I let out a bitter laugh. "Protecting you from what? From a husband who loved you and wanted to build a life with you? They weren't protecting you, Kristen. They were controlling you, and they were abusing him. And you let them, because it was easier than standing up to them." I stood up then and told her that divorce papers would be filed within the week, that Ethan would be seeking sole custody of Sophie, and that she should get a lawyer. She looked at me in confusion, starting to ask something, and that's when I decided to tell her the truth. "I'm not your husband," I said clearly. "I'm his twin brother, Nathan. Ethan came to me 7 weeks ago, covered in bruises, terrified, broken. He asked me to switch places with him so he could get away and heal. So I stepped into his life and took his place. I've been living here, taking the abuse he was taking, documenting everything, building a case to destroy the men who were destroying him." I watched her face cycle through confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally understanding. You're his brother? This whole time? Everything you've been doing to Ethan for the past 7 weeks, you've been doing to me," I continued. "Every hit, every insult, every moment of cruelty. I took it for him, and I documented all of it. Your husband is safe, away from you and your brothers. He's been healing, and I've been gathering evidence to make sure Blake and Craig face consequences for what they've done." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something break behind her eyes, some final piece of denial shattering. Then she put her face in her hands and sobbed. I felt no sympathy. I told her I'd be staying in the house that night, but she should probably go to her parents' place. I went upstairs to the guest room I'd been using. Behind me, I heard her crying, but I closed the door and shut it out. It was done. I'd exposed them, sprung the trap, and they'd walked right into it. Everything else would unfold from here. The legal proceedings, the consequences, the rebuilding. I pulled out my phone and called Ethan at the cabin. He answered on the first ring, voice tight with anxiety. I told him everything about the dinner, the evidence, the reactions, Blake and Craig being arrested, Kristen's complicity being exposed, how it was finally over. He was silent for a long moment. Then I heard him crying, great, gasping sobs of relief and release. "Thank you," he said when he could speak again. "Thank you. I don't know how to ever thank you enough." "You don't need to thank me," I told him. "You're my brother. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Now stay at the cabin for a few more days while things settle, then you can come home to your new apartment." I'd already helped him secure a 1-bedroom place across town, far from Kristen and her family. A fresh start where he could rebuild his life and have a safe space for Sophie during custody visits. We talked for a while longer, both of us processing everything, exhausted and relieved, and still struggling to believe it was really over. After we hung up, I just sat there in the quiet room, feeling the bruises ache, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones, and I let myself breathe. The legal aftermath unfolded over the next several months. Blake and Craig were both charged with multiple felonies: assault in the 2nd degree, criminal threats, stalking, and harassment. The evidence was overwhelming. Both eventually took plea deals rather than risk trial. Blake got 18 months in county jail, plus 3 years probation. Craig got 14 months plus probation. Both were ordered to have no contact with Ethan or Sophie indefinitely. Ethan's divorce from Kristen was finalized 4 months later. He got sole physical custody of Sophie, with Kristen having supervised visitation rights. The judge who reviewed all the evidence was appalled at how she'd enabled the abuse, and made it clear in his ruling that Ethan was the stable, protective parent. Kristen's parents, Frank and Patricia, actually reached out to Ethan afterward. They apologized profusely, said they were ashamed of their sons and their own blindness. They wanted to maintain a relationship with Sophie if Ethan would allow it. He agreed to supervised visits, recognizing they were Sophie's grandparents, and they seemed genuinely remorseful. As for me, I moved back to my condo and my regular life. The bruises healed, the soreness faded, but the experience changed me in ways I'm still processing. I have a deeper understanding now of what it means to be truly vulnerable, to be trapped in a situation where asking for help seems impossible. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel and help us bring you more and better stories. Thanks.